Hello, and welcome back, listeners, to the Transformative Pedagogy Cultivating Equity in Education podcast series. I'm your host, Laura Paz Huerta, and once again, I'm thrilled to have you join me for our unfortunately last episode of our series and continuing this essential conversation about educational equity. In today's episode, we're focusing on equity in school funding and resources. Sounds like a lot of fun, right? Before we get into this big issue, I really want to thank everyone who has taken this ride with me, has listened to all these episodes, and has truly opened their mind and their souls and their hearts to truly being equitable in education. It's not always easy, right? It's not always a place where you will be supported, but just know that there are other educators out there. There are other admin out there, counselors, whatever it may be that is your position in education. Just know there are others who are just as like minded as you, who want to give our students the education we might have not received, right? And so to close this series up, I really wanted to focus on, some disparities when it comes to school funding and resources that are given out to some schools. So without being said, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. And I hope you enjoy this last episode. I think it's imperative to say that the issue of funding disparities is absolutely critical and just inequitable, especially when discussing educational equity. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, schools in low-income areas often receive $1,200 to $2,000 less per student than their more affluent counterparts. Let that sink in for a bit. It brings us to the fact that this gap significantly impacts the quality of education that students receive, that your students receive, that my students receive. From availability of advanced coursework to the conditions of classroom facilities, better yet, the deplorable conditions of some classroom facilities. And it also impacts sometimes technology resources. For instance, right, underfunded schools are more likely to have outdated textbooks, dilapidated school buildings, and limited access to advanced placement courses. And yes, this does have an immensely profound impact on students' academic outcomes. And this also contributes to the achievement gap between wealthy and low-income students, unfortunately. Now, the Education Law Center further underscores this point. It demonstrates that with inequitable funding, systems see significant discrepancies in per-student spending across districts. So what does this contribute to, right? Well, it contributes to an environment where students in wealthier districts have access to more educational opportunities, while students in underfunded districts struggle with fewer resources. These disparities are not just numbers. They translate to real-world consequences for our kids. According to the Economic Policy Institute, students in underfunded schools face higher dropout rates, lower college attendance rates, and reduced chances of securing stable employment compared to their peers in wealthier districts, unfortunately. Well, this is a matter of social justice. Not only social justice, but it's a matter of social justice in education. These funding disparities are often disproportionately affecting historically marginalized communities. This includes African American, Latino, and our low-income students. The Learning Policy Institute explains that schools in low-income communities are also more likely to face teacher shortages and have less access to specialized academic programs, further compounding educational inequities. The lack of investment in these communities absolutely undermines their students' potential. And, it perpetuates these cycles of socioeconomic inequality that we see today, especially today. With everything going on in our current government, right? And the shutdown of the Department of Education and layoffs across the board for universities. And we're seeing that impact our students as well, right? Those who are graduating this year and for years to come, right? We're going to be seeing a lot more of this inequality and socioeconomic inequality affecting our students. Now, while there are these disparities that are vast, there's hope. There's always hope. There's always that light at the end of the tunnel, right? The Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools highlights the power of community-driven advocacy in pushing for policy changes that advocate for fair funding. There's also a matter of grassroots movements that are proving successful in mobilizing communities and policymakers to absolutely demand better funding for schools serving low-income students. I know we've already started off real good, right? But just sit tight, because in this episode, we're going to continue to explore these funding disparities and truly grasp and understand these long-term effects on student achievement. We're going to discuss actionable steps educators such as myself or you, or, if you're a counselor listening to this or admin listening to this, right? As well as policymakers and communities. Hey, our parents can get involved. How to address these systemic issues. Together, we'll explore how we can work towards a more equitable education system, how we can help, right? Because what we want is for every student to have this opportunity to thrive. So get cozy, grab your cup of coffee, or settle in during your commute, because we're going to do it. We're going to dive deep into the funding inequalities that shape the future of our students. So let's start off by truly defining the issue. School funding in the United States primarily comes from local taxes, property taxes, state funding, and federal support. So this system inherently creates disparities, as wealthier areas with higher property values generate more funding for their schools. Our low-income communities often struggle to meet these basic needs, right? According to the Education Law Center, this funding system leads to significant inequities. You'll see wealthier districts generating far more funding per student than those in our low-income areas. For example, in the year 2020, some districts spent as much as $25,000 per student annually, while others spent less than $8,000. This is a gap of over $17,000. And what do we see here? Well, this disparity results in large differences, especially in the quality of education that students receive based on their geographic location and the local tax base. These disparities are even more pronounced when examining predominantly low-income and minority-serving schools. On average, schools serving low-income, predominantly Black and Latino students, they receive about $1,800 less per student than schools in wealthier, predominantly white districts. And this is coming from the Economic Policy Institute. So what do we see? We see that this gap is particularly concerning as it's perpetuating these inequities that already exist within the education system, often exacerbating like the disadvantages faced by marginalized communities. So the funding gap affects more than just outdated textbooks. It dictates the quality of educational opportunities available to students. An example of this is schools in wealthier districts are more likely to provide access to advanced technology, small class sizes, which is something as teachers we all want, and overly highly qualified teachers. In contrast, right, we see underfunded schools often lacking basic infrastructure, extracurricular programs, and even sufficient classroom supplies. Some of these underfunded schools may have larger class sizes, which unfortunately limits teachers' abilities to provide important individualized attention to students when students have a question or need to go back and go over something, right? There's research that's consistently showing that these inequities lead to disparities in academic achievement. For example, there's a study in 2019 by the Learning Policy Institute that revealed that students in underfunded schools scored 20% lower on standardized tests compared to their peers in better funded schools. Furthermore, like these students were 15% less likely to graduate from high school. 15%. And 10% less likely to attend college. And that to me as an educator is devastating. These outcomes contribute to the perpetuation of cycles of poverty and limited future opportunities for students in these underfunded districts. This systemic inequity really highlights the urgent need for a reimagined funding structure that prioritizes fairness, and truly ensures every single student, regardless of where they're living, has the resources they need to thrive. In 2023, the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools emphasizes the importance of grassroots movements in advocating for equitable funding and absolutely showcasing how local communities are pushing for policy changes that ensure fair distribution of resources to all students. So let's talk about what these funding gaps look like in practice. Imagine a classroom in an underfunded district. The teacher is juggling about 30 to 35 students. This is far above the recommended student-teacher ratio of 16 to 1, which is a recommendation by the National Center for Education Statistics, which came out in 2021. With only a handful of outdated textbooks, there's really no access to digital tools, which is the case for some of these school sites. And it could happen that some of these schools lack support staff to assist with special education or the English language learners program, even though these students make up a significant portion of the school population. And so, according to the Economic Policy Institute, it came out in 2019 that schools in low-income districts are more likely to have larger class sizes. So what does this mean? Well, it further hinders their individualized attention that they can obtain from teachers. And honestly, effective learning is not something that they see. But when you contrast this with a classroom in a wealthy district where the average student-teacher ratio is closer to, let's say, 12 to 1, students have laptops and access to cutting-edge STEM labs. And teachers also receive regular professional development funded by these district budgets. So these classrooms benefit from extracurricular programs that are supremely robust. And they also benefit from advanced placement courses, which are offered in 85% of affluent schools, compared to only 54% of underfunded schools. Again, this is factual. It's coming right from the National Center for Education Statistics. And this came out, I want to say, 4 years ago in 2021. So this lack of access to advanced opportunities in underfunded schools limits students' exposure to critical college prep courses and career readiness programs, which are, dare I say, crucial for their future success. So unfortunately, these disparities in resources create inequitable starting points for our students. It limits their potential before they've even had a chance to compete. The effects are unfortunately profound and systemic. For example, predominantly African American, Latino, and low-income schools are 15% more likely to have crumbling infrastructures as their school learning environment. Outdated heating, plumbing, electrical systems, Wi-Fi that doesn't work if for some reason they do have laptops provided to them. This creates an unsafe and distracting learning environment. And these physical conditions contribute to a negative learning environment and disrupt their performance. So what does this do? It further disadvantages them. They're already facing significant barriers, and we're adding more. Unfortunately, these schools are far less likely to provide enrichment opportunities for these students. According to the Learning Policy Institute, in 2019, students in underfunded schools are 25% less likely to participate in STEM programs or arts education, which are critical for developing skills and fostering creativity. The lack of access to these programs means students in underfunded schools miss out on diverse opportunities that are vital for their cognitive development, critical thinking skills, and creativity. This further entrenches the educational disparities that already exist. And it's unfortunate that these gaps are not isolated incidents. They represent systemic inequities that reinforce social and economic divides. And addressing these disparities is essential for leveling the playfield for our students and ensuring that they all have access to a quality education that prepares them for success. So I know we've gone into a lot of information, right? So how does this truly affect our students, right? What's the impact of it all? Well, the consequences of inequitable funding ripple across students' lives. There's studies that show that schools with adequate funding can reduce class sizes, provide additional support services, and offer amazing enrichment programs that foster higher academic achievement. For instance, the Learning Policy Institute in 2019 found that reducing sizes of classes in elementary schools can improve student performance by as much as 22%. That's low, especially for low income and minority students. These smaller class sizes allows for a more personalized attention and more focused learning, especially for students who may require that additional support. Additionally, right, adequately funded schools are more likely to employ experienced teachers, which research shows that boosts student outcomes by up to 30% in some cases. These experienced teachers have that expertise that implements these effective instructional strategies, and they're able to foster these positive learning environments that benefit students' academic and personal growth. So when you put that into contrast with schools with inadequate funding, obviously there's going to be struggles there to retain those qualified teachers, leading to higher turnover and inconsistent learning experience for students. When these resources are absent, you can feel the students being disengaged and feeling unsupported and unprepared for higher education, unfortunately, or the workforce, whatever path they choose, right? So underfunded schools are less likely to offer these advanced placement courses, what we know as AP courses or college prep programs, and limiting opportunities for students to excel academically. There was a study done by the National Center for Education Statistics that stated that only 54% of underfunded schools offer AP courses, compared to 85% of schools in wealthier districts. To me, that's unfortunate. And just 35% of underfunded schools offer dual enrollment programs that allow students to earn college credits while they're in high school, compared to 68% in better funded districts. These programs are critical for helping students prepare for post-secondary education and ultimately access opportunities that they may otherwise be out of reach. This lack of access is not only troubling, it's unfortunate for students in historically marginalized communities. They're already facing these systemic barriers, and it keeps adding up for them. For example, right, African American and Latino students are disproportionately affected by these funding disparities. Why? They're the ones often attending schools that receive $1,800 less per student annually than our predominantly white schools. This funding gap exacerbates existing inequities, leaving students in underfunded schools with fewer resources and fewer opportunities to succeed academically and socially. Schools in low-income areas are also twice as likely to operate with outdated facilities, inadequate heating systems, and insufficient access to technology. That darn Wi-Fi, right? This directly impacts the quality of education that's provided to those students. These physical and technological deficiencies hinder their ability to engage with the curriculum and limits their access to these tools. This unfortunately perpetuates that achievement gap. And, we've touched upon the achievement gap before. Research from the Economic Policy Institute further underscores these challenges, showing that students in underfunded schools are unfortunately 7% more likely to drop out of high school compared to their peers in better funded schools. Additionally, students from these poorly resourced schools are 10% less likely to attend college and 15% more likely to experience unemployment or underemployment after graduation. And it's this lack of adequate funding that is also tied to higher rates of student suspension and expulsions, which disproportionately affects our students of color. Again, further exacerbating educational inequities and just creating this cycle of disadvantage that extends well beyond high school. It's that domino effect. These inequities don't just affect individual students. They're perpetuating these cycles of poverty and inequality in their communities, and not just in our communities, across the nation. And so addressing these disparities is not just morally imperative, but it's an economic necessity for building a fairer and more inclusive society. There was a 2019 analysis done by the Learning Policy Institute, and it found that achieving funding equity in schools could boost the U.S. economy by up to $3 trillion over the next decade. So by increasing educational attainment and workforce productivity, investing in education or education equity, it's not only a solution to social inequality, but it's also a crucial driver of economic growth. And yes, it's unfortunate with the current political climate that we live in currently, with the slashing of the funds for Department of Education, right? Which some of their focus on DEI was imperative to a lot of our schools. So we're gonna have to see how that affects our students now more than ever. So as educators, we have a responsibility to advocate for equity, both in our classrooms and beyond beyond the four walls of our classroom. Whether it's attending school board meetings, writing to legislators, or participating in equity-focused professional development. Every action you take truly impacts our students, and it matters. The disparities in funding between districts are glaring and even pervasive. And it's up to us to use our voices and actions to make a change. Be the change. For those listeners in underfunded districts, I encourage you to collaborate with local organizations and share your stories. Personal narratives can be powerful tools for raising awareness and demanding change. Research from the Economic Policy Institute shows that students in underfunded schools are 7% more likely to drop out of high school and 10% less likely to attend college compared to their peers in better funded schools. Let's help change that. And sharing these stories and drawing attention to the impact of these funding gaps, it's helping advocate for that change. For those of you listeners in well-funded districts, I urge you to not look away. Do not look away from what's happening. Use your privilege to support schools in need, whether it's by donating resources, volunteering, or advocating for policy reforms. The Education Law Center highlights that predominantly African American and Latino students, again, receive $1,800 less per student than predominantly white schools. Affluent districts can leverage their resources to support their less funded counterparts. This can be done through targeted efforts and partnerships. And what does that give us? It fosters a more just and equitable educational landscape. And yes, as educators, we have a responsibility to advocate for equity, both in our classroom and out of it. Again, every action we take matters. Whether it's joining a grassroots movement like Alliance to Reclaim Our School States, that advocating for reform or just making our voices heard in our communities, this is a big impact. These collective efforts have real impacts. For example, Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools has worked on policy changes that advocate for more fair and equitable school funding. And this is showing the importance of grassroots activism and influencing policy at the local and state levels. For my listeners in those underfunded districts, I encourage you to collaborate with local organizations and share your stories. These personal narratives can be powerful tools for raising awareness and demanding that change. In 2019, the Learning Policy Institute found that adequate funding directly correlates with better academic outcomes, particularly in those schools that reduce class sizes and provide more access to quality teaching. So these actions truly have a tangible effect on students' academic performance and their long-term success. And again, for my listeners in these well-funded districts, do not look away. Yes, your students are less likely to experience academic failure and more likely to attend college. And in a stark contrast to students from the underfunded areas, right? Your support can help bridge these gaps by directing resources to areas where they're most needed. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. Equitable funding isn't just about numbers. It's about giving every child the chance to succeed. Again, research from the Learning Policy Institute shows that when students are provided with adequate funding, there is a 22% increase in their performance, especially for our students that are low income. This isn't just an educational issue. It's an economic issue. It's a moral issue. And yeah, it affects future generations. Listener, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey to uncover the realities of funding disparities and their impact on education. And if this episode, as well as this entire podcast series, resonated with you, please share it with a friend, a colleague, or whoever you think it may impact. Let's continue to keep the conversation going. For more resources and research on this topic, right, check out the episode description. Something truly resonated with you, right? And I just want to make sure that you know that this episode was made possible by the insights from the Education Law Center's report. And it shed light on the disparities in school funding systems and their impact on educational equity. We also had the Learning Policy Institute study, Investing in Students, which provided compelling evidence of how adequate funding directly correlates with better academic outcomes and opportunities for students. We also leaned on the National Center for Education Statistics, which offered a critical examination of the challenges underfunded schools faced, from infrastructure limitations to restricted access to advanced courses. That was a lot of good information. The Economic Policy Institute's research on the school funding gap helped us understand the long-term consequences of inequities on students' futures, including higher dropout rates and limited access to higher education. And finally, the inspiring work of the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools reminded us the power of grassroots activism in advocating for policy reforms and driving equitable change in education. So listeners, I encourage you to explore these centers, this research, these institutes, and the organization like Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools in order to, pave the way for a more just and educational system and just be more knowledgeable. I want to thank you for joining me on this amazing journey. I appreciate your ears and your openness to learning and being amazing advocates of students. Farewell, friends.